Welcome to the Cape Horticultural Society's visit to the Barrydale Open Gardens in October of 2019. This is the view through the Trudeau Pass towards Swellendam and the coastal plain beyond. In 1841, Joseph Barry opened Port Beaufort to shipping and wanted a pass through the Langeberg to the valleys beyond. So the Trudeau Pass was started, and it is 13 kilometers long and was eventually finished in 1873. And even today, with several restorations and improvements, it is a wonderful stretch of road with a lot of the original rockwork still visible, and it makes the journey along the N2 and up through the pass to Barrydale a very scenic route. The Barry family of Swellendam then laid out the township of Barrydale in 1882 to serve the fruit farming area of the valley. This is a view of the surrounding hills of the Klein Karoo, and you can compare the lush valleys along the river courses with the rocky, dry koppies and hills as you drive along the Route 62 from Montague in the west through to Oudtshoorn in the east. The Klein Karoo boasts a very specific flora. There's a whole book on the plants of the Klein Karoo. So one does come across a lot of unusual succulents, or plants that you see in Namaqualand and Namibia in amongst these rocks. It is very hot in summer, but it's also very cold in winter. So there are the two extremes for the plants to cope with. We drove up to Barrydale on the Friday, and in the evening we hosted a bring and share braai, and this is Hildegard Kraus giving us a chat about how she and her husband came to be living in Barrydale. Hildegard used to work at Kirstenbosch, where she was renowned for her work growing daisies, and she still does grow daisies, but to a much lesser extent. And we visited her property later in the weekend and learned more about what she is doing in Barrydale. There were 29 gardens or places of interest to visit in Barrydale over the weekend, so we were kept busy, and there were many different styles and types of gardens. And this first one was a small cottage garden on quite a rocky, hilly slope. And there were wonderful roses in Barrydale, and Rosa Banksii, the typical yellow form, plus its alba form, were very, very attractive. We had seen a lot of these in our visit to Prince Albert. They obviously like the cold winter weather they get in the Karoo, and then reward you with a tremendous display of flowers in the spring. The lotus we're all very familiar with here in Cape Town, but it's unusual to see such a vigorously flowering plant, and we were very impressed with what we saw in this little garden. There's also a very attractive water feature down here that they had decorated, and we then moved on. The next garden was much bigger, obviously a more fertile soil, and it sloped down into the valley bottom and was full of fruit trees, olive trees, quite a large lake with water lilies in it, and the pergola. And at the upper end of the garden, a very attractive patio with tillandsias hanging from the trees. So they're obviously sheltered from the cold winter weather there. And this very attractive chandelier, and we saw many of those around Barrydale and visited the gallery where they had been made on the Sunday. The most notable thing about Barrydale, I think, is the rock walls. And we noticed this the very first time we drove through the village on the R62, before we ever turned off into the village proper. They are used as boundary walls, to edge flower beds, as features to clad existing brick walls or block walls. And there have obviously been a whole generation of stonemasons who are very equipped to deal with the local stone. And this one outbuilding in the left has even got it weighting down its roof. So obviously in the cold winter weather, when the storms come through with the cold fronts, they need the rocks to hold the roofing down. So it's not only Cape Town that gets these gale force winds. These are some more of these rock features, a little panel holding a tile and some beautiful old Victorian stained glass, which perhaps might not be as old as Victorian, because all these old crafts are enjoying a huge resurgence of interest in both the doing of them and in having them in the houses. This is the garden of Jean and Les Minter, and it really was quite totally different to anything we had seen or would see in Barrydale. There was not a blade of grass, no lawn at all, and they had relocated to Barrydale, I think from up country, and they were just enchanted with the variety of gravel and rock and stone that was available for landscaping in Barrydale or around Barrydale. And this is the entrance to the property from the road. And I just wonder if in a few years the birds and the cats won't have perhaps mixed muddled the dark and the light gravel, if it will still be as pristine as it was then. But it was very attractive texturally, and we were all extremely impressed. There was a small vegetable garden and a rose garden. But round at the back, there was a big area of planting and a circular lapa with a braai place. The hammock was there, the preparation table for the cooks for the braai, and it was beautifully done. We were really amazed at the rock work. And so it was time for a photo call. So this was most of our gang. We all travelled independently around the gardens, but tended to collect at various points where we were malingering. And you can see how beautifully the rock work was done in this wall. We had lovely weather that weekend. You can see it was sun hats and sunglasses weather. And after a cool night, it really was a beautiful day. The planting was indigenous, so there were many, many aloes and succulents. There were crassulas, there were sedums and cotyledons, and the odd fakie was flowering, those lovely orange fakies. So I'm sure there would be a lot of interest even when the plants were out of flower. But we were very impressed. There was a lot of rock work there, so a lot of work had gone into the actual landscaping and the plants that they had used. From there we went to a totally different small cottage garden, but the flowers were outstanding. We have never ever seen such pots of pansies and petunias. They were just incredible. And it turned out he uses Osmocote, which is a slow-release granular fertilizer which lasts 3 or 4 months. So as you plant up the bowl, you put the Osmocote in, and then it feeds the plants for the duration of their lifetime. But it really was outstanding. Well, it wasn't all gardens and plants. The Joubert Trudeau wine cellars sent a gentleman along with a collection of wines, And as you can see, it was very popular. There was a lot of tasting, and I'm sure a bit of buying as well. So we will have to find out what their comments were on the local wines. And we also had a finger lunch there. So it was a little bit of a downtime in a very busy day. These plants were in gardens belonging to some of the coloured folk, and there were about 10 of their gardens taking part in the Open Gardens weekend. And although they were small, a lot of work had gone into them, and they're very carefully tended, and they had some really interesting plants. This lovely established cactus on the right was full of flower buds. And then the artistic use of the old kettle for a plant container is something which is becoming very fashionable now. And one of the homes, we actually were invited to go right through it. The folk were so friendly and warm, and we really just found it so unusual. So it all worked out very well, and they'd enjoyed participating.
Yes, yes.
On the Sunday morning after the church service, the church was open for a flower festival. And it really was lovely to see the way the locals handled flowers, because they don't have access to the exotic flowers that we have in Cape Town. And it's mainly indigenous, with the proteas and the succulents, but handled very attractively. The cynaroides in with, is it rhinostobos? Someone can confirm. And then the succulents on the left could be virtually a permanent planting, because they will survive like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. In fact, if you keep them in a bright sunny spot, you'll keep the colour in those crassulas. I'm sure the aloe will put out roots, as will the speckbourne there. And you've got some echeverias down there. They will also be happy to grow in a situation like that. Another way of handling indigenous flowers, the pincushions are teamed up with, is it the blue statice and some Neisner fern, very attractive combination. And then on the left we have, it's either spartium, the Spanish broom, or cyclopia. Now unfortunately the Spanish broom, the spartium, is on the hit list of invasive aliens, but it is such a beautiful shrub, and I think one just if we have it, you have to be very aware that it can be invasive. It can seed itself anywhere and everywhere. Cyclopia is the honeybush plant of the honeybush tea fame, and there are many species of that grow in the arid Karoo type areas. So it's lovely to see these indigenous plants being used in flower arrangements. Now this wasn't anybody's garden per se. It was actually just a corner plot of ground which someone had landscaped into a labyrinth with a retaining rock wall and banks of planting going up, mainly indigenous with the odd tree. And the entrance was this beautiful stone archway. And you actually see stone archways like this in some of the gardens at the Chelsea Flower Show. So we really have a lot to be proud of in our stonemasons' work here in South Africa. It was just a quiet, meditative and reflective area, and very, very different in such a small town to find such a beautiful spot. Right, here we are on the Sunday morning, and here is Hildegard's property with a few of her daisies in flower and her other great love, her horses. And I think that probably was one of the reasons that took her to an area like Barrydale. She's on a property of a good maybe 3 or 4 acres, and it's actually called the Witsand Arboretum. And she's busy planting it up with unusual trees and running a small nursery. This is a view down, and you can see more of these attractive stone walls. and that is the back of the Langeberg going along towards Heidelberg and along the edge of the coastal plain. Another thing that Hildegard is doing some selective breeding of rooibos plants, because rooibos has been hard hit with the drought, and they are trying to breed seedlings which are more vigorous, more resistant to the drought, more tolerant of the soils, and she is doing a lot of work with the rooibos tea growers. And this other plant on the left was a surprise. It's a little salvia, very small, very dainty, and it comes from Namaqualand, Namibia, and through the Great and the Little Karoo. And she uses it as an edging like you would box in town here, box or the myrtle, for edging the bed. But she said the salvia is very attractive, it's the right size, it doesn't grow too big and have to be chopped back a lot. And we all collected plants and brought them back to Cape Town, and we'll see what people say after a few years how they find it is doing here. She also had a nice little old-fashioned rose garden with mainly old roses, and this one on the left, which you might struggle to see the actual flower because the flower's green. It's the green form of Rosa chinensis, a tiny little flower there in the middle. I don't know if the cursor's actually showing it to you. And it has been in cultivation since 1743, because in those days the unusual and the strange forms of plants were all the rage. And flower rangers and floral artists just love this sort of thing. It just is so very different. And this is Hildegard's other claim to fame, that she has found this lovely form of Lampranthus barrydalensis, which is very much like Lampranthus bicolor, but not as vigorous, as has a smaller flower and is a more straggly growth form. But let's see how it does in Cape Town, because a lot of plants were bought there and brought back to Cape Town. And now, almost a year later, we will be waiting for them to be pushing their flowers and see how they enjoy Cape Town's weather. We perhaps are a little wetter than Barrydale, not as cold in the winter, not as hot perhaps in the summer, but this is a lovely addition to those wanting to grow colourful indigenous fakies. They weren't all indigenous plants that we saw. It's got a very English climate, having such a cold winter, so the English bearded irises were doing very well with lovely coloured flowers. And also there are a lot of these Lewisias around, which are actually alpines and rock growing in their crevices. And we've seen them in places like the Bodnant Gardens in North Wales. They make big plants. And surprisingly, they belong to the family Portulaceae. And nurseries have been selling them, and we're actually wondering how they will take our hot summers, hot dry summers, and if they will survive that, because they're very much a temperate plant. So we saw a lot of them here in Barrydale as well, and we've seen them in the nurseries here in Cape Town. So it'd be very interesting to hear from you members, you know, how you found them, have they survived, and are they going from strength to strength, or do they have a limited lifespan here? There were also some strange plants which we actually couldn't put names to, including this unusual looking Artemisia on the left, which was growing in the garden where we had our Sunday lunch. Some sort of Artemisia, I'm sure, but I don't think it's South African. And then on the right, this lovely Tylicodon, which you come across if you go up into Namaqualand, beyond Springbok, or up into the Tankwa-Karoo, into the Roggerveld. Any arid areas, Tylicodons are very dominant parts of the landscape. This climber was up a telegraph pole and along a wire, And so we had to use telephoto lenses to get pictures of it. And we were with Glenda at the time, and we both said, we're not sure what that is, but perhaps someone can let us know, because it really was incredibly full of colour and very vigorous in its growth as well. Right, now this is the art gallery. What was the name of it? The Magpie Gallery. And Shane's creations just covered every type of recyclable. And invariably they were turned into lights. So we have a hanging chandelier here, where I think the worst job was probably painting the little sticks with white paint. But then one could twine beads and lights through there. And then on the left, a collection of bottle tops. And I think he probably takes all the recyclables from the whole of Barrydale for his gallery. Another form of decoration, I don't think it was actually a chandelier. You can see Andrew and Errol below. You can just see their little heads beneath this ball of bottles. They're all colour-toned, white, turquoise, aqua, blue. I'm not sure what they had in them originally, but it was one enormous ball hanging from the veranda roof. And then the other chandelier is actually tins, which have been cut down to make petal shapes and then inverted upside down, one on top of the other. Quite incredible. Another chandelier made of twigs. This one's unpruned and would make a lovely Christmas decoration with these tiny fairy lights all going through it. And yet more bottle tops, red ones and blue ones over light fittings. Really quite amazing. And so to birds, both the created birds and the wild birds. The malachite sunbird was really very busy in the bottle brush at the bottom of our garden, and we had some lovely views of him as he collected nectar. And this other bird, I'm not quite sure what you would call it, but very creative, and as I say, that art gallery in Barrydale was something else. After our weekend in Barrydale, Errol and I always loved doing these unusual passes and poorts, and we went on to stay at Van Waterberg so that we could visit 7 Weeks Poort and also Bosleeskloof. And 7 Weeks Poort is absolutely amazing. It was started in 1860 and, as you can see on the signpost, finished in 1883. And it was worked on after Mering's Poort, and it's 17 kilometres long, following the course of the Hayes River, which you pass innumerable times. And although it's only a gravel road, it was in very good condition, and the road workers were doing a lot of work improving the culverts and the drainage of the watercourse as we went up. It was well used in the old days before the Gamkepoort Dam was built and the road couldn't go through to Prince Albert. But it still is a spectacular piece of road. The scenery was unbelievable, and I really do recommend the detour. It comes just after Ladysmith. You turn right towards Oudtshoorn and then left up into the Poort, and just to meander up there and have a picnic. And we found a little farm which was happy to do accommodation, so I'm sure we shall go back there. The flowers along that river valley of the pass included this lovely pelargonium, which we think is zonale. It was a very big plant, but it was growing in the light shade under some bushes right beside the road. So that's why it looks a little bit dusty and not the usual green, bright green colour. Then also all through the river valley, closer to the stream, was this Polygala fruticosa on the left, and we battled to identify it because it looks so different to the polygalas we normally see. And it was a good 2 meters high and was really attractive. We also took a drive from Van Waterberg up the road from there to Sanbona. And although we didn't go into the reserve, it was very interesting as you got into the typical Klein Karoo hills and rocky scenery to suddenly come across an enormous patch of succulents. It was very difficult to photograph them. There was a fence between us and the majority of the plants, but we got close enough to photograph one with a flower on, and it really looks odder than odd. And one of our friends who grows bulbs is also a succulent fanatic and gave us the name of Gibeum pubescens. So we can pass that on to you and say, well, we can understand why people become quite fanatical about growing these succulents because they are so peculiar. And of course, like many plants, once they flower, they are completely transformed. No, pause. After 4 happy days exploring Barrydale and beyond, it was time to wend our way back to Cape Town and leave this troop of baboons up on the rocks above our cottage. They were very vigilant as our night watchmen, and I'm sure they were hoping we had left something behind for them to eat, because it looked very arid and barren up where they were. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, our first Zoom presentation, and please forgive any inadequacies. It has been a huge learning curve for Errol and I, and much help from Glenda and our daughter and our grandchildren, who are all so much more computer savvy than we are. But I just hope it comes through easily, smoothly on Monday night, and you get some pleasure from it. Happy memories for those who were with us, and perhaps an incentive for those who didn't come, once we can travel, to take a weekend in Barrydale. Even if you can't explore all the gardens that we did, it is a lovely place to spend a weekend. So take care and happy gardening.